Hello everybody, I'm your guide and this is the first video in a series with more than 150 entries where we'll look at the fascinating and often frightening monsters inscribed in our trusty monster manual. In each video, we'll cover what's in the manual, but also other interesting tidbits I've found in my travels. This companion series is meant to educate, entertain, and elevate your excursions into the more dangerous areas of the Forgotten Realms. Everywhere from the cemetery behind your local church to the Nine Hells and everywhere in between. And even some places much, much more interesting. So come, join me. Let's begin. Our first entry is that of the Aarakocra. Aarakocra, known also as birdfolk or sky hunters, are humanoid birds that patrol the endless currents and mighty winds that make up and surround the realms of Aarakocra in the elemental plane of air. You can also find them guarding the borders of their home against potential invaders from the elemental plane of earth, such as gargoyles, who are their sworn enemies. Aarakocra were also one of the major races hailing from the inner planet of Collier. On Collier, they supposedly have a democratic society typically run by the female Aarakocra. Males, however, were not banned from running for office, but society was strongly against it, and as of the late 14th century DR, no male had ruled for over 1,000 years. These creatures stand about 5 feet tall with a massive wingspan of 20 feet who live to be about 65 years of age on average. And, as the more well-traveled and perceptive among you would expect, they're quite light with fragile, hollow bones and lean legs that end in talons. However, just because they're quite light, I can assure you from experience, you don't want to find yourself on the business end of those talons. Anyway, the males of the species tend to have brighter plumage, your reds, yellows, and oranges. Females, on the other hand, typically have more browns and grays. However, this is certainly not set in stone, and each tribe will tend to have distinct plumage, so be careful not to embarrass yourself. Speaking of tribes, Aarakocra colonies are typically built around a single large, open-roofed nest made of vines. The eldest male will serve as the leader of said tribe, with the second eldest acting as a tribal shaman of sorts. On average, these colonies will have about 30 individuals, with most of the denizens being of the fighter variety, but this can obviously vary. Aarakocra can also speak, read, and write Common, Auran, which is the language of air elementals, which we'll see later in the series, and their own language known as, of course, Aarakocran. Their speech tends to involve chirps to provide emphasis and meaning in the same way humans might use facial expressions. Personally, I find some of the names quite hard to pronounce, but it's certainly not impossible. Moving on to religion, I've found that most of them worship Siranita, who has the appearance of a female Aarakocra with silver skin and pink gold feathers. We can cover deities at a later date, though. You may find tribes who also worship other gods, but Siranita is going to be the most common by far. Okay, so that's the basics. Let's get into some information you might want to know if you stumble across an Aarakocra tribe while out on your travels. Now, since the vast majority of Aarakocra are not inherently hostile, the question is, what can one expect if you're traveling and are welcomed into a colony of Aarakocra? And before I get into it, please be aware that this is by no means an entirely comprehensive guide. This is simply what I've learned on my travels. These are sentient beings with their own potential quirks and customs, so use your judgment and maybe don't let the less charismatic among you take the lead when you first encounter our subjects. The resemblance of Aarakocra to birds isn't limited to physical features. So, as one might expect, certain bird-like traits from other bird-like creatures will translate over to our bird-like Aarakocran friends. For example, how they're going to be claustrophobic in nature. After all, they're used to soaring through the endless skies, so if you find an Aarakocra underground or working in your nearest bustling city, you found a rather rare specimen. Either that, or you found an Aarakocra who's not there of their own free will. Also, if you find yourself adventuring with a friendly Aarakocra, maybe let them stay outside on lookout duty if you're delving into that spooky cave at the foot of the mountain. Continuing on, other mannerisms you see in smaller birds will also be evident in our subjects, such as preening or tending to their feathers to remove any unwanted passengers. They want their feathers to look as nice as possible, and that's one way they'll go about it. They're also typically hyper-vigilant, always prepared to take to the sky whenever danger rears its ugly head. One of the more intriguing things I've discovered is how the concept of ownership appears to be a somewhat foreign one to them. This might seem odd to many of you, but it makes sense if you think about it. Aarakocra are what we might describe as a free spirit. Mobility is key, and anything tying them down isn't needed. And when it comes down to it, who really owns the sky? So it's certainly not unheard of to have an Aarakocra drop from the sky and snatch up some livestock, or perhaps a particularly shiny trinket before taking to the sky once more. This is all just perfectly natural to them, particularly the ones who haven't had much interaction with other people. But the ones who spend time among other races can certainly learn to inhibit these impulses. However, if you're actively trying to catch their attention, a glittering object or shiny trinket just might go a long way. Next, we'll cover the known major colonies of the Aarakocra on Faerun. The first is located in the Stormhorns, which is the name given to the mountains that mark the western and northern frontier of Cormyr, a rather wild and untamed place absolutely crawling with monsters, I can assure you. The second is the Cloven Mountains in Vilhan Reach, or the Reach as it's commonly called, which was the site of many great empires and many great disasters throughout history. The third being the Mistcliff Mountains, which span the northwestern coast of Chult. There also used to be a settlement in the High Forest here in northwestern Faerun, but as far as I know, it was almost totally destroyed by a green dragon whose name yours truly cannot pronounce. As kind of a side note, such an event could absolutely be the impetus for an Aarakocra to take up the life of an adventurer. Typically, they enjoy peace and solitude, but a dire threat to their people or a mission of vengeance could drive them to leave their homes. You just probably won't ever find an Aarakocran adventurer who's out for treasure or glory, despite their penchant for shiny trinkets. The few Aarakocran adventurers I've met in my days have had quite a knack for hit-and-run tactics, where they'll take to the skies and dive their enemies with weapons or talons and immediately return to the sky safely outside the range of most monsters. So, in conclusion, Aarakocra are a rather fascinating carnivorous species who are generally peaceful but can definitely hold their own when prompted to do so. They typically favor warm, temperate, mountainous regions and can be seen soaring through the sky in either the air or material plane. So hopefully with this primer, the next time your travels take you to your nearest mountain or the plane of air itself, you feel more equipped to interact with some of the locals. Bring something shiny, brush up on your Sirenita lore, and keep this entry in mind and you'll do just fine. And if you've had any interesting interactions with the Aarakocra, let me know down below. Okay, so that was the Aarakocra. One entry down and quite a lot more to go. If you turn the page in your monster manual, you'll see the next entry is the Aboleth. This is going to be a wild one if you're not familiar with them. So subscribe and hit that bell to be notified when the next entry is released. I'll see you in the next installment. This is your guide signing out. Be safe, take care, and happy trails.